Okay, everybody out there in YouTube land, good evening. It is I, Matt Yancic, the founder and head game master here at Manufactured Myth and Ledger Domain. And tonight, as I usually do, mostly on a weekly basis. Sometimes I'm having a busy week. Tonight, I'm bringing you yet another role player, another face among the thousand. I'm bringing you Matt Forbeck, who I'm very excited to have with us tonight. So I did quite a bit of research on Matt. I creeped on him. I stalked him. I'm not going to lie. Just because I like to know. Because sometimes you think you know somebody, like you're like, oh, I saw that game or I read that book or whatever, but then you have to go back and look. And the one thing that I decided from looking at Matt's background is that he is probably the most prolific. I mean, I know he's the most prolific I've ever had on this show, but he's got to be one of the most prolific RPG. Well, I should say maybe creators, because he does so much more than that. He does RPGs, he does writing. There's a zillion things he does that I have talked to and that I am aware of right now. So he's an award-winning game designer. He's a New York Times best-selling author, if you can believe that. And he's been doing this stuff since he graduated college, from what I understand. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. We're going to find out about that. So the projects that Matt has worked on, out of all of the things he's done, have been nominated for, I think, 28 Origins Awards and won something like 15 of them. So he's worked on the Deadlands RPG. He's worked on the Lord of the Rings RPG, and of course. He's done the Shotguns and Sorcery RPG, which was adapted from the novels he happened to write of the same name. And then he also has done, from looking at it, I see there's a little common strand there. He's done a ton of superhero work, work in the superhero genre. So he worked on the Brave New World RPG, the Authority RPG, which is like really cool because this is something that I've got like laying around all the time, always looking at, and I'm like, who the heck is Matt Forbeck? What? Oh, I get it now. He's also worked on the Marvel Heroic Roleplaying Game, which is another one I had laying around. Not just laying around, but stuff I look at and I'm like, oh, I love the ideas in this. It's Cortex, by the way. And now he's working. The newest thing is he's working on the newest iteration of Marvel's RPG, known as the Marvel Multiverse role-playing game, which I believe the playtest is going to be available in March of 2022, though it may be delayed by 2 hours due to this conversation. I'm not really sure. We'll find out. So Matt, I'm so sorry. I don't mean to
That
speak
was a hell of an
for you.
introduction. Thank you.
Well, the thing is, it's hard. It was so hard to pin down the things that you've done, and I tried to hit the highlights, but the truth is, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Um,
You work at this stuff for 30 years and things build up, I guess
I
32 years now, something like that. Yeah, it's been a long time.
Yeah. Is there like was that here's the thing is I just gave an intro of the things that I noted and I think are cool. Are there a few things that I didn't mention that you'd like to mention to
Oh man,
like
I've done so many screwy things over the years, right? I did toy design for a while. I've done electronic toy design. I did Marvel Heroes battle dice for
That's right.
Playmates toys.
Yes.
But I also they had a Star Trek utility belt that was a role play kit that I had to write 90 seconds of dialogue for, and I wrote a little random adventure generator that went along with it.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
I did a Bluetooth audio interactive fiction app for the Milwaukee Public Museum where you can actually, which that isn't even on my website because I'm like, how do you describe this really? But it's
That's
this thing
cool.
where if you want to like make a decision one way or the other, it figures out which way you went by where you walked, and then a Bluetooth beacon realizes which decision you made.
Can
Right.
I
So, oh,
can I stop you there because
sure.
here's the thing. So I really when I do these interviews, I like to sort of go chronologically just for no other reason
Go
than
for it.
my simple mind needs that. But the thing is, I always wonder, like I see things at a museum or I'm looking at something and I think to myself, how does somebody get the gig to do that work? How did you end up writing an interactive What did you call it? An interactive
Interactive audio
tour?
app.
Okay.
Um, so the way I got that was Julian. God, I'm gonna miss his last name. A friend of mine on Facebook. Yeah, Julian worked for. It was the director of the museum,
Hmm.
and it's going to scratch the back of my brain till I remember. But anyhow, Julian was the director of the museum, and he had worked in Mayfair Games back in the
Okay.
early '90s, late '80s. And I don't think we had ever crossed paths there, but I had done some work for Mayfair, and
Hmm.
we were kind of the same group of people with each other. And so when he was looking for somebody, when he became the director of the Milwaukee Public Museum, he was looking for somebody localish who could come in and do that kind of work, right? Somebody who not only understood interactive stuff, but had a reputation for being able to write engaging fiction as well.
Right.
And there just aren't that many people that fit that bill, right?
Yeah.
So he called me up, and I ended up driving up to the Milwaukee Public Museum from Beloit, Wisconsin, where I live, which is about an hour and 15 minutes, like 20 times, I think, just
Yeah.
going back and forth and visiting the museum and checking out the installation when they were upgrading the Streets of Old Milwaukee, which was this 50th anniversary of it. And it was this beloved installation that every kid in Wisconsin who grew up in the southern part of the state had to go to for a class field trip at some point.
Right.
And they hired me in to help out with this. There was going to be this thing, besides all the physical stuff they were doing, but then putting in these Bluetooth beacons so that it would actually, when you're walking around on your phone or the machine they would give you, whichever one you wanted, it would say, okay, Houdini has lost his paycheck. You need to help find it, right?
That's
Where
cool.
could it be? And it's actually hidden somewhere in the museum,
Right.
right? So then it would give you a dialogue of somebody talking to you, and then you would have the choice of going either up the street or down the street. And if you went up the street, it would know that you had gone this way.
Right.
And then once you got to another point, it would say, you've gotten here, but no, it's not here. And here's another decision for you. So it's
Right.
kind of like a choose your own adventure story, or like the Endless Quest books I wrote for Wizards of the Coast and for, what was the publisher? Studio Press in Candlewick. It's kind of like doing that, but with an interactive audio app,
It's
right?
interesting to me because there are so many times when I see these things and I wonder how do people find these jobs and how do
Yeah.
they get them? And I mean, obviously there has to be someone that creates this stuff. And you seem to me to be someone that has sort of touched just about every little like thing you can do as far as like writing or design goes. Was that kind of is this the way you've always been, or is this
I
something that
mean, I started out as more of a hustler, a guy who would like pound on doors and ask
right,
for like, I need jobs, I need work. I mean, I'm
right.
helping out at Gen Con booths. I'm what they call a booth weasel or a booth monkey, and I like run demo games and all this kind of stuff. And now for like the last 15 some years maybe, I have not had to look for work at all. I mean, it
Mhm.
just kind of maybe even longer than that, maybe 20 years. It's mostly people know me by reputation, and they just contact me, right? Like I just had another guy contact me out of the blue this week, I guess over the weekend, saying, "Hey, I got this book. I worked with you at this one publisher. I'm at a new publisher now. We need somebody writing this kind of book that I think you'd be perfect for. Are you
Mhm.
available?" And I'm like, probably not. I don't know.
Yeah.
I got to figure out what I got to know deadlines, money, all that kind of stuff. And it turns out that my eldest son graduated from college a year ago, and he's actually starting to help me now. So if that's okay, I'd be happy to bring him on as a co-writer to do this book. And we're in early negotiations, but I mean, it's typically how it happens. I get a lot of work just falls in my lap. When I did Marvel Heroes Battle Dice, for instance, it was a guy who I had met. I designed this game back in 2000 in the early 2000s, and the guy called me up, and I had not heard from him in 5 years. And I met him once at a meeting about I'd done a Monster Rancher collectible card game for a company called Artbox, and then we had a meeting with Playmates Toys because they were doing the little plastic figures that
Yeah.
you could
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
run with it. And we just had a meeting. We just like showed up, talked for like a half hour, and then said our goodbyes and thought, okay, that was fun. What the hell will ever happen out of that? And then 5 years later, I get a phone call, and it's Pat Linden over at Playmates Toys. He says, "Matt, we have this game this guy just proposed to us, and we don't know what to do with it. You're the only game designer I know. So can you help me with this?" And I'm like, what? And he's like, "Yeah, we have this great game." And I helped him redesign it. I said, the idea they have is this little die that pops open like a
Mhm.
treasure chest. It's spring loaded. You squeeze the sides, it goes boop,
Mhm.
and you stick figures in it. And then you roll the die, and there's numbers on the figures, and you add everything up. It's a very simple game. But the game was atrocious. It was terrible. I'm like, it goes, "Well, great. We paid you to figure that out.
Right.
Can we pay you to fix it?" I'm like, "Yes, you can pay me to fix it." So So it ended up being Marvel. They did a Marvel Battle Dice game, and then we did a DC version. It never came out in this country. It might have come out in France. I don't, sometimes these things like literally just come out in different countries. You have no
Right.
idea.
And you don't know where it is, and it just like
I'll
where
see
it
it
pops
pop up on
up.
eBay. I did something for Mattel called Puppy Tweets, which was a collar that had it was a dog collar toy that attached to the dog's collar, and it would detect movement and whether it was at rest and figure out the time of
Oh,
day.
cool,
And then it
actually.
would make up tweets from your dog, and it would actually have its own Twitter account.
It's kind of like a Tamagotchi kind of thing. Like, I don't know
Yeah,
if
but
you
with a
know what I'm
live
talking about, but
element
it's a
attached
real,
to
right, you've got it
it.
really hooked up to an animal and it's actually communicating. You know what? Let me ask you something though. So I don't normally, here's the funny thing, folks. I send emails to guests and I usually cold email them and I don't know them from Adam. I don't know them at all. And the thing that I'm immediately struck by from talking to you is that you're really super sociable. You're obviously very communicative. You clearly communicate, and you. Do you think you're like a social? Like what I'm noting and what I'm trying to get at here is, I feel like you've got like a zillion little connections because you
Oh
strike
yeah,
me as being the sort of person that talks to everybody. And
yeah,
do you
I'm
think
very
that's
social, right? Like my unofficial title is well, one of my titles is I used to be called the nicest guy in gaming, and I was like, no, it's John Kovalik. He's the nicest guy in gaming.
okay?
Everybody knows
Let
that.
me write that down.
John's a good buddy of mine. He does Dork Tower, and he drew
Yep.
Munchkin, and he did Apples to Apples. He lives
Yep.
about an hour north of me, and we hang out whenever we can. Pandemic's not made it very easy, but most of it's because I would just talk to people and just treat them as nicely as I can because that's the way I was raised. I think it's how you should treat people. I also sometimes get called the mayor of Gen Con because Gen Con's my favorite convention of all time. This will be my, I think, 40th in a row coming up. I started out going when I was like, it was in 1982, so I was
Wow.
like just turned 14 years old. Um, and I run a couple different parties there. I run also the Diana Jones award ceremony, which is a big industry only party that I invite
Mm-hmm.
like 300 to 500 people show up, and we all have a couple drinks. We give out an award or two, and we have some fun, right?
Right.
But I just try to be kind and open to people. I don't think there's any reason. Like for instance, there's a lot of these what we call gatekeepers nowadays who are trying to keep people out of games. Like you're
Yeah.
not a real gamer or whatever for whatever silly reason they're talking about. But I mean, to me, I'm just thrilled to have all these people in here, right? Probably about 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I would look around Gen Con and say, man, where's the next generation of game designers coming from? I don't see enough young people in here.
Yeah.
I don't see enough people of color. I don't see enough women
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
And they've been coming in, but then sometimes they play and they just go away. None of them are really getting invested in becoming designers, right?
Right.
And holy cow, we got just a raft of wonderful people of all stripes
Yeah. Right.
being game designers nowadays. I mean, and there's more games being produced than there ever have been for tabletop stuff. And I am thrilled, absolutely thrilled. And I want to welcome all these people with open arms and tell them we love them because it's just wonderful to see this, right? I mean, I thought I was maybe going to be like these, you ever see like these model railroad guys? It was really hot
Mm-hmm.
in the 70s and 60s and 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's kind of gotten to this thing where only 80-year-old men are really doing it anymore, maybe in their
Right.
70s, right? And I didn't want role-playing games and tabletop games to become that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Again, I feel like I'm part of this continuity of something that's actually building into a real art
Right.
form that people are going to be able to enjoy for generations, like they do with film and novels and computer games and everything else. And to see that happen, I'm just thrilled about. Right? You don't know how it's ever going to happen. You do your best to try to push it angles, and you're hoping that everybody else is doing the same thing. I'm just thrilled to see it happen.
Well, the thing that so I have two modes in my brain. One is like game master mode, and the other is like
Yeah.
teacher mode. So I've been teaching for like 20 years, and one of the things I'm often trying to do with my students is I'm trying to get them to open up and communicate and go outside of their comfort zone and talk to different people. And what do you think it is? And now ladies and gentlemen, we're totally off the rails now. I'm not even looking at my notes and the
All right.
questions I asked, but that's fine. Um, what do you think it is about your own personality that makes you so easily outgoing and open about that? Why would you be called the mayor of Gen? Why would you become the mayor of Gen Con? Like, what is it about Matt Forbeck that enables
Yeah,
this to
honestly,
happen?
I was a shy kid, right? I was picked on. I was bullied. I had asthma. I had glasses. I was shortest kid in my class. But my parents raised me to be a good person and to help people and be a bit of an activist too. My mother
Hmm.
was in Democratic politics from when I was a kid. My father was an
Hmm.
attorney, then a judge. So we've always been very involved in our communities, right? Um, but I think honestly, I especially early on, I attribute a lot of that to just playing role playing games, right? They can role playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, that kind of stuff, kind of broke me out of my shell. It came around at a very important, formative time in my life when I was, 13, 12, 13, 14 years old.
Mm.
And it helped me learn how to talk to people, right? And also to develop competence at things enough that I could speak about them authoritatively, whether it was a role playing game or something else, and then to be able to riff and make things up off the top of my head, right? And once you've been running games for people over and over, I mean, I can entertain anybody for an hour at a time on any topic, just making a game up
Right.
off the top of my head. And that's a skill I've learned over the years. So that means that a conversation doesn't frighten me at all, right? In fact, I enjoy those things. I enjoy just talking to people and meeting new people. So that helps a lot, I think.
If you were, so you were saying that you were a shy, and actually I kind of identify with a lot of what you're saying. If you were saying like you're a shy kid, you were picked on, all of that stuff when you were younger, um, did you know that? Because I know you went to University of Michigan for
Yep,
creative
that's where I
writing.
graduated. Yep.
Was that always kind of your trajectory, or did you decide at a certain point, that's what I'll do? Like, were the two tied together at all? Like, did you feel like, okay, well, I'm going to try and find fun in reading books and playing role-playing games, or did you sort of say, you know what, I this is what I want to do anyway?
I just like to read, right? I part of me being asthmatic, man, I spent boatloads of times in hospitals. So, and I was around adults a lot of the time because of that. Maybe that helped. I knew everybody in the emergency room in my hometown by name, right? They all knew me when I walked in the door. It was like Norm at Cheers, Matt, hey, how
Right,
you
he's
doing?
back.
Exactly. I mean, literally, I was in the hospital 3 or 4 times a week when I was a young kid, right? Being shot up with epinephrine and adrenaline, suffering, all these different things to help me be able to breathe. And I really wasn't sure I was going to live beyond 18 years old or whatever. So fortunately, we found some good medication when I was about in ninth grade, I guess.
Hmm.
No, not ninth grade, but I was about 9 years old. I was in fourth or fifth grade, and that really helped open up my bronchial tube, so I was able to talk to people, and I think that gave me a bit more confidence too. But I was a kid who learned how to read early. I was like, my mom says I started reading when I was like 3 years old, right? And
Mm.
even one of my English teachers when I was in high school said, I came in and saw you reading the Jungle Book when you were 5, right?
Mm.
Like the real one, not
Yeah,
the
that's
Disney one,
that's
right?
not an easy
No, I'm
Rudyard
like, well,
Kipling.
it
Kipling.
was there and I was reading. So that's how it works. Um, but I just love to read. I love being involved in stories. I always kind of wanted to be a writer. I won a writing contest when I was 9 years old as well. And I was like, yeah, I get attention, I get prizes. This is awesome, right?
Yeah.
So I think that really colored it a lot. I was very good at school in general, and I was very good at mathematics and things like that. So when I went off to college at the University of Michigan, I did summer science camp when I was a kid at University of Wisconsin Eau Claire, where I learned to do computer programming when I was like 12 or 13 years old. And that was back when computers were, like literally they were
Yeah.
using punch cards in the labs,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of rare to be doing that in those days. But when I went to the University of Michigan, I ended up, my parents said, you need to get a degree. I said, I want to write. They're like, well, you need to get a degree that will, pay your bills. Writing doesn't pay the bills. I'm like, yeah, well, probably not. But so what do I do? So I actually I had a degree program that was approved by the deans of both colleges. From the College of Engineering approved me for electrical engineering, computer science, and the College of Literature, Science, and Arts approved me for a creative writing degree through the residential college, which was where I was at the University of Michigan.
Hmm.
And for 2 years, I went through this, and I actually went through the first 2 years of engineering, and then I realized I just hated it. Right?
Right.
And I didn't really hate doing it. The problem was that I knew the plan was that I would get both degrees, and after in 5 years, and then I would go get an engineering job or a computer science job. There weren't really video games jobs in those days.
Right.
They were rare on the earth. Um, and I would work in the day doing my computer job, and I would write in the evenings. But I knew I was too lazy to pull that off. Right? I knew I would come back from because I would give everything to my other job. I would be
Yeah.
like, I'm going to work this as hard as I can.
Yeah, it's hard.
And then I would come home and I'd say, I want a beer, I want to see my girlfriend, I want to play a game. And the chances of me actually sitting down to force myself to write a novel were
Right.
pretty small.
Right.
And I didn't want to hate myself when I turned 40. Right. So I decided, my dad calls it my quarter life crisis instead of my midlife crisis. But I called him up, said, Dad, I'm dropping out of engineering. He says, you're past the drop ad deadline, finish the goddamn term. And I'm like, okay, dude, I'll do that. And, so I ended up finishing the term, and then I graduated with my creative writing degree. This is the other thing. I figured out I could get that degree in 3 years total, right? So I
Get
graduated
the
in 3 years.
combined degree or
No, just the one
just the
degree, the
creative?
creative
Okay.
writing degree.
Okay.
The 2 degrees are going to take me 5 years. But if I just switched to creative writing, I could squeak out in three
Right.
years, right? And I'm like, So and Dad, I'm going to save you a boatload of money. Mom and Dad, no cost here at all, right? Or no extra cost, because Michigan wasn't cheap. I was out of state. So I ended up doing that and getting out and then saying, if I'm going to try this thing with the writing and the game design, because I was doing role-playing games still. And I was freelance role-playing games and editing and stuff when I was in college. And I said, if I blow it within the next 3 to 5 years, whatever, I'll just go back to college and finish the engineering degree.
Right.
Right. And then apparently I haven't blown it. I graduated in 1989, so I'm 32 years into this.
Yeah, you've done
And probably
pretty
that
well.
that partial degree is not any good anymore. I think I'm screwed. So,
Right. Maybe a little bit out of date at this
yeah,
point. Maybe.
the problem is at this point I'm no good at anything else, right? So I have to stay with this.
So what was it then? Because here's the funny thing, like I meet so many people who will get their creative writing degree, and as a teacher, I fully and completely support people in pursuing the things that they want to pursue. But a lot of them will often say, "Oh my goodness, well I've got it, but now it's kind of useless." Or okay, let me put that in quotation marks because as a teacher, I don't feel it's useless, but they feel it's useless. What was it that you did? I'm going to say right that maybe other people have failed to quite see. How did you leverage that creative writing degree? Did
Right.
you, because obviously I got to be honest, like I got a film production degree, but that didn't help me get like when I ended up, so I used to work for 20th Century Fox, and
Oh, cool.
they never asked me for my film production
Exactly,
degree,
right.
and I thought, oh my God, I should have gotten an engineering degree, and then I'd have something to fall back on or whatever.
Yeah, but then you
What
wouldn't have done the film stuff.
it's sort of yeah, I guess you're right. What did you do to help you leverage that and get
Well,
you
part of it was I got mentored into the gaming industry mostly because I grew up in southern Wisconsin, right? So I grew up in Beloit, Wisconsin, which is this little town on the southern border. If you're driving between Madison and Chicago, you're driving up from Chicago, when you hit that border and you blink, that's my hometown, right?
okay?
And that little piece of land is 40 minutes away from where Dungeons and Dragons was created and published for the first 25 or whatever years it was going at TSR, which was up in
Mm-hmm.
Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. So when I grew up, I went to my first convention when I was 13 years old. It was the Winter Fantasy in Lake Geneva. And I got hooked. I got hooked really hard playing games and going to conventions. And then I got kind of mentored into it. So I one summer, my dad said, you either need to get a job or you need to start a business. And I'm like, I don't want to work for anybody. My dad was his own boss at that time. I'm like, I don't want to work for anybody else. Um, so I'm going to start a business. So I started a magazine, a zine, as you would call it nowadays, because
Yep.
it was
Yep. I
black and white. And
totally know what those are.
I mean, it was above your basic. It wasn't just photocopied or mimeographed. We actually went to a printer. They put it on photograph plates and all this other kind of stuff. And I put every dime I had into it, which I was saving for college, which was about $1,000 back in 1984 or whatever. And I lost it all right pretty quickly. I think we went 2 issues. Probably the best tuition money I ever spent,
Mm.
right? Because I learned more from that expenditure than I did from anything else I ever did.
Mm.
And I had my own booth at Gen Con. I think I turned 17 that summer. I was 16 when I bought the booth, 17 when the show actually happened, and sold subscriptions of this. And again, then we had to go issue apologies and refunds to people. So
But you were still like that's pretty cool. Like actually, I mean, those are the days when you're putting together like because I remember those days as well, and it was so fun to like go to my local hobby shop or go
yeah,
to a model shop or something, and you would see this product that was like, and for those of you that don't remember, and or maybe were born after this, but you'd see like a photocopied thing with like local artwork from local people, tons of articles and things like that. Um, so you were. in short, super prolific even when you were not necessarily had moved into the industry. You were still creating all of this stuff.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was doing this stuff for fun, right? And then my friends and I did the magazine. We did all the writing. We did the artwork. I didn't realize it was a thing, right?
Right.
Apparently, a lot of other people were doing this at the same time. We're like, well, what do you know?
Right.
Um, but we just kind of got into it. We saw a lot of other stuff. We just loved doing it, right? Then I started going to Gen Con, and then in addition uh, to playing games, I started running games. So I would be
Mm-hmm.
running games, the Role Playing Gamers Association, the RPGA. And the way I got into that is actually I was part of a group of people who won a Dungeons and Dragons tournament at Beloit College in my hometown. I'm actually wearing a Beloit College shirt right now. One of my kids is going to Beloit College, and I
Oh,
actually took
cool.
classes there when I was in high school. And Gary Gygax showed up and signed my copy of, I think it was the Temple of Elemental Evil or something like that.
Oh, wow.
Maybe he signed my player's handbook. I forget. Yeah, I got a couple of autographs from Gary. And the prize was 1 year subscription to the Role Playing Gamer Association newsletter and a membership in the organization. I'm like, yes. So I was hooked into it, and I started running games at the shows, and people got to know me, and I would be running 40 hours worth of games at Gen Con in a four-day weekend, right? Because I just adored it so
Yeah.
much. So then moving on to doing it professionally wasn't all that big a change. The funny part was the guys at TSR that I knew at met at these conventions formed their own company called Pacesetter, which was a company that published Chill and Star
Yeah.
Ace and Sandman and
Mm-hmm.
Wabbit's Revenge and Wabbit Rampage and all these really fun, amazing games, right? And they actually invited me up to play test with them. So I would drive up after soccer practice in high school to Delavan, Wisconsin, where their offices were, and play test games with them in the evening, and just had a ball. So when I was going off to college, a guy named Troy Denning,
Yeah.
yeah, you may have heard of Troy Denning. He's a great
Ah,
writer.
I know. Yeah,
Yeah,
maybe he's done a few little things.
written dozens of Star Wars novels. He's writing more Halo novels now than I have.
Mm.
But Troy actually went to Beloit College in my hometown, right? And it turns out Greg Stafford, who was one of the great designers of all time, also went to Beloit College. Um, and we, you know, Troy came up to me as the Gen Con before I was going off to college, said, "Oh, do you know Will Niebling? You should talk to Will if you're going off to Michigan. He's the biggest Michigan fan in the world." And Will had actually met at my first Gen Con. We played Fight in the Skies, played Dawn Patrol on Sunday morning at Gen Con in 1984, I guess. And then met him and a guy named Marty Stever that was playing there. And I'm 14 years old. These guys were, well, Marty's a bit older. Will was much older at the time, but 15 years older. And then he was also turned out to be the first vice president of sales at TSR. So, but he had been kicked out of the company in this crazy coup thing where they had knocked him out, and then he exercised a stock option,
Mm.
and then he sued them, and it took him 10 years, but he won $1 million from them. Great story, right? And when Will found out I was going to Michigan, he's like, "I'll tell you what, I do sales for Coplaw Games, Mayfair Games, Iron Crown, and Grenadier, amongst others." He's a sales rep. And there's a distributor in the Detroit area in Livonia called Greenfield Hobby Distributors. And I want to send you up there twice a month to do inventory, and then I'll write orders off that. And every time I come into town, I'll buy you dinner and drinks. And if you can find some kids to buy me football tickets, I'll buy your football tickets. And
Right.
so it's this nice
Right.
little,
Little
kind of
arrangement.
exactly right going on. I ended up, Will's one of my best friends. I ended up living, he bought a house because he was trying to establish residency. He was living in Lake Geneva at the time, trying to establish residency for his kids to go to college at Michigan. I ended up living in his house with his kids because it gave me a great break in the rent. And we just had a wonderful time. He's one of my favorite people in the world. So, but what would happen then is Will would take me to all these different conventions, and I'd be working in the booth with Iron Crown and Mayfair and everything else. And as we're just, there's downtime and there's time after the show or whatever, as we're doing dinner or in between people talking, I'd say, I could write that stuff. I could edit that stuff. I could help you out with that. And I just kind of got mentored into the industry that way.
Mm.
But part of it is because I just adored doing it so much, and it's such a great time doing it that was how I spent a lot of my free time. I also, screwed around, played games with my friends, drank way too much beer in college and all that kind of stuff. Um, but games are always a big part of my life that way. So.
Was there a one thing that I often hear from not often, but I sometimes hear from creators or from people in the industry. They'll say that maybe there's this point where it's sort of crossed a line from being a hobby or being fun to being something more serious. I
Yeah.
don't I you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from talking to you, it seems like that line was never crossed. I sort of feel like
Oh, no.
or is that
I
not?
mean, I plowed past it.
Oh,
Well, I mean, there was a good friend of mine, Ray Greer, who was one of the guys behind Hero Games way back in the day. He looked at me when he first met me. He says, "Oh, you're a professional now." That means when your hobby becomes your profession, you need to get another hobby, right? I was never very good at that, unfortunately. So, but you know, I have to admit, I don't look at games the way I did when I was just a player, right? And I
mm-hmm.
haven't for decades now. I'm a terrible game player. I never get good at anything because when I look at a game, I'm like, how does that work? It's a puzzle to me, right?
Right,
I want to know how it works, how the mechanics work, why it works,
right.
why people think it's fun. What are the parts here that I think work, or what's wrong with it, and what would I do to fix this, right? So I usually end up playing a game once or twice, and I'll put it away forever. I'll never see it again, right?
Mm,
And then I move on to the next game. And it's not because I don't love playing games. It's just that my relationship with them has changed.
right.
So that my attraction to them now is what's the new and shiny that I can figure out about this? Good, it's done. Now I'll move on to the next thing, right? And I learned these things. I just kind of incorporate them in the back of my head and I apply them to whatever I'm going to be attacking next as a game design issue.
So it sounds like what you're kind of describing here is you've sort of, it sounds like a transcendence of some sort. Like you've transcended to a different form of enjoyment from the
Yeah, I think
games.
that's accurate, actually. Right? It's not that I don't like playing them, and actually, when I sit down and play with my kids, who will often like to play the same game over and over, it does change things. I mean, sometimes I will start to get good at things, and I will play video games more than I play tabletop games in
Mm-hmm.
that sense because I'm not designing that, but I also work in video games, so part of
Yeah,
that for me is an excuse to figuring out how does a narrative work in this, how
yeah.
can I apply this to what I'm doing, why is this fun, right? Um, but video games are a different thing for me. When I play video games, especially nowadays, I play a lot of narrative stuff. And when I was starting out, I would just play things where I got to shoot things, right? They
Mm-hmm.
were just
Right,
reflex, whatever oriented,
right.
because it was so very different than what I was doing with tabletop games, right? So I could put that part of my brain aside that analyzed all this stuff and just get into it and play the game itself, as
Do you,
opposed to what I was doing with tabletop.
Was there someone during that? So the way that you're kind of looking at games now and looking at creativity now, was there somebody back then, maybe while you were being mentored or when you were first entering the industry or your first few years, was there anyone that was particularly influential on you that you can maybe look back on and say, hey, I kind of might have followed what they said, or I disregarded what they said, or I is
Yeah,
there?
I don't know. It would be hard to pick out one person. I mean, like I mentioned, Troy really got me into
Mm-hmm.
doing this kind of stuff. Steve Sullivan, there was a whole group of guys, Steve Sullivan, et cetera, that were part of the Pacesetter group. Will really got me into this stuff and would answer every question I ever had. We had a lot of long times traveling together,
Yeah.
and I was this kind of guy who would like, I can't stand a silence, so I would ask questions all the time,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he got to the point where he's like, "You always ask questions, so I'm just going to tell you." I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, fine. Good to hear. And but he was great. He was great at explaining things to me, right? He would show me how this worked, how that worked, and because to me it was always like, even when you're talking about publishing a game, I'm like, how does the publication system work, right?
Right.
How does the distribution system work? How do these games get from an idea to being made? How do you find financing? How do you find a printer? How do you source all this stuff? How do you find artists and work this? This is one of the reasons I became a publisher when I was in my late 20s. I founded Pinnacle Entertainment Group with Shane Hensley
Mm-hmm.
because I had accumulated all this knowledge working for other companies and with Will's help, just feeding this stuff in my head that I'm like, wow, I should just use some of that, right? I know more about this than most people on the planet. Maybe I can make some use out of that. What I learned is it's really hard. Right?
Yeah.
It's not easy to do. Even if you know what you're doing, it's not easy to do. I have a lot of respect for the people who manage to pull it off year after year. When I got out of Pinnacle, I was like, I thought about starting up another company, and then AEG made me a really good offer for Brave
Mm-hmm.
New World and offered to publish it for a year after I sold it to them at least. And I'm like, that's okay. And I had my first child was there, and I'm like, yeah, maybe having somebody else tackle that kind of stuff for a while is great. And I've been kind of leery about going back to it since then. Although I am starting to dip my toe in it. I self-published a few novels several years ago, or several novels, few years ago, however you want to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I just took over the publication of the Shotguns and Sorcery role-playing game because the original licensor had some horrible delays and their license expired. So now I'm publishing that.
Mm-hmm.
And my son and I are going to be doing a 5th edition version of it. We're hoping to put on Kickstarter
Oh,
later
wow.
this fall, maybe next month, hopefully.
Right.
So,
Oh,
uh,
cool. What? Let me ask you, because you've, ladies and gentlemen, I feel that for Matt Forbeck, it's very useful to have the resume that the full PDF resume
that's
posted
crazy.
that he posted on his website, because he just glosses over like zillions of things. He's gone through so many different things that have happened. I'm going to rewind here a little bit,
Sure, go
and we're
ahead.
going to slow down a little bit. We're going to go back to like founding of Pinnacle,
Sure.
and all of that. You flew out, from what I understand, to Virginia just to join Pinnacle or to start Pinnacle. Is that correct? And
What happened is Shane actually paid for my ticket. He's like, I'm going to fly you out here. He flew me and Greg Gordon out, right? And Greg was a guy who, again, if you want to talk about mentors in game design, Greg was actually a great one, right?
hmm hmm
Um, when I was in college, one of my jobs in the summer of '88, I think it was running around and teaching people how to play the DC Heroes role-playing game that Greg had designed, which had this really brilliant logarithmic system that is a pain to write and explain to somebody. But if you get them to, when you talk to them and explain it to
yeah,
them and show them how it works, you can see this light click on in their
right,
eyes. And
right,
it's really great, right? But it's also very complex in that sense. But if you're the kind
yeah,
of gamer who likes a little bit of math, fantastic. And both Shane and I were freelancers in those days, and we had done some work for Greg when he was at West End Games, right? We had
hmm
done work on Torg and a few other things, Shatter Zone,
mm,
I think. And so when Shane wanted to start his own thing, he called up his two buddies, being Greg, basically in the industry, and said, "Would you be willing to help me do this?" And we both flew down there. Greg, unfortunately, was his marriage was dissolving at the time. He wasn't able to actually join in with us because that was obviously a big priority for him. He had a kid, and he wanted to make sure he was doing all this properly, as opposed to getting distracted by something else. And I was like, I was young and hungry and had all this knowledge in my head. I'm like, this is great, but you're going to ask me all sorts of questions about publishing and everything else. And I'm going to want to share that. And if I'm going to get that involved, I want to have a piece
hmm
of the company. So I
hmm
ended up, I think at the time I was a 20% owner, and eventually I became an equal owner. Um, and I was the president of the company. Shane was the CEO. And it was one of those things where like Shane was supposedly doing the business side as far as like running the numbers. His wife is the accountant, all that kind of stuff. And I was basically handling the publishing side. We also had a computer game division that Shane was running that we did a Deadlands video game that never went anywhere, that we pitched
hmm
like crazy. But we were young and idealistic. It didn't happen. But then the tabletop side, I was in charge of that, and I lined everything up, and got the writers and got the contracts and did all the editing, and contracted the printers and all that good stuff, all the exhausting stuff.
At that point, though, like, so you just sort of jump into the role of being president. Like, did you know what you're doing? Are you making it up as you go along,
Oh, we're
or are
totally making
you
it up as we go along, right?
okay? Fake it till you
Well,
make it.
on the other hand, I mean, I could count on that my probably my pinkies. How many game design companies were started by people with business degrees, right?
hmm
Most of them are started by. Well, I'm sure now somebody in the chat will say, "But what about blah 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 blah?" But back when we were doing this, everybody who started a game company was basically a game designer that wanted to publish their own games,
hmm
right? And some of them just became publishers, but that was because they realized that there were a lot of other people out there coming out with great ideas, and if they were really good at publishing, they could help bring those out,
Yeah.
right? John Nephew is one of my favorite examples of that. He was a guy who was a guy who runs Atlas Games, founded Atlas Games,
hmm
right?
Yeah.
And he started out. John's a brilliant designer. He does some really good stuff. Hasn't been doing game design for many years because he discovered that, to his delight, he's really good at the publishing side. He's
hmm
really a sharp guy. He knows how to figure the cheapest way to do anything, the
Right.
best way to do anything. He's really good at processes and all that kind of
Right.
stuff, and at managing people. And he just kind of really grew into that role, right? When we were starting Pinnacle, it was basically me and Shane, and then we had a couple of friends that he was going to bring on as well. I think at our height, we were up to 14 employees, right, including us and Shane's wife. But we, as the company fell apart in toward 1999, 2000, we realized that the smart thing to do was basically have a tight group of core people
Right.
that were deeply invested,
Right.
whether with time, money, whatever.
Yeah.
And then the rest of us were freelancers at that point, right? Anybody else who's going to be involved, we would hire on at a freelance level, much in the way that a movie studio does, right?
Yeah.
Or you just say, I'm going to hire these guys in for this
Right.
project. if we work great, I mean, obviously, if you love them and you try to work with them, you'll hire them on every project you can. But trying to hire people in a game company and do benefits and regular paychecks and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff is a
Yeah.
real challenge.
Was
So
there something you sort of were mentioning, was there something that you discovered about yourself when you were presidenting that you didn't know? Like, were you better at doing some certain things than you thought you'd know, or were you worse, or was there
I
something?
learned to be better about giving feedback. I remember
Mm-hmm.
being called out a couple of times. I was really rude to Charles Ryan once about his graphic design. And Shane looked at me like, "You're down in the South here. We don't talk that directly to people." I'm like, sorry. I said, "Yeah, I don't like it. It looks awful." Right. And I'm like, "Oh, I probably wasn't even that kind." Right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I realized, when you're talking to people, and I've learned this myself over the years too. And Charles is now one of the guys who's in charge of running Money Cook Games. He's
Yeah,
been
he's at
doing great stuff,
MCG.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And he's one of my good buddies, right? And I love him and his family, and they're great people. But um, at the time, I was not being very kind because I was just like, okay, I'm focused. This is no, don't do that. But over the years, I've realized that what you really need to do when you're giving feedback to people is not just tell them, I don't like that, or I don't like this, or change this, or change that. You also need to tell them what they're doing well,
Yeah.
right? If you don't tell them what they're doing well, the impulse is to throw everything out, right? Even the stuff they're really good at, they will change that because they don't know. You leave them floundering in the darkness, they will grab anything,
Yeah.
right? They'll throw away everything and grab anything else they can. What you really need to do is say, I really like this. What you're doing here is fantastic. I'm not so fond of this. I would like you to change this. And there are good ways to do that without doing like what they always say, the shit sandwich that you have to feed people, right?
Yes. Right.
Tell them something good, tell them awful, something. You don't have
Yes.
to be that manipulative about it. What you really have to do is say, look, obviously I'm working with you. Otherwise, yeah, I like what you're doing. Otherwise, I wouldn't be working with you at all, right? Otherwise, I'd have just fired you. There's no reason that you would come back.
Right.
But people don't know that, right?
Yeah.
They just think they're on tenter hooks, and they're like, uh, when they're getting feedback, they're afraid that they suck. So you need to first of all make sure that I hired you because I saw something I really like, and this is what it is. And I'm going to tell you about it in detail because I want you to realize, I want you to emphasize these great points. And if there are these parts here that didn't turn out the way that I thought they were going to turn out, and could you change this to maybe do this? And maybe I'm wrong. I'm just giving feedback. Now, because I'm the guy writing the checks at the moment, my feedback counts more than other people.
Mm.
But honestly, you shouldn't take that feedback to heart and just change your style and everything else. If it doesn't work out, go find a job with somebody else. Go find work with somebody else.
Mm.
One person's feedback should never define you as a creative person, right? Even if it's the person writing your checks, you should figure out people who appreciate what you're doing and then work with them as much as you possibly can. That's more of a meta thing. But the moment, I think when you're giving feedback, you need to make sure that it's you're telling people what they're doing correctly. Because again, a lot of people, especially creatives, will just kill them in the soul. They'll start to shrink, and then they
Right.
start thinking that nothing they're doing is good,
Right.
when that's
Well,
the farthest thing from the truth.
it's interesting to hear that because I think what you're describing is just sort of like self-reflection. And I think there are a lot of people that don't have that self-reflection. Like I see, being a teacher, I will often instruct a student and I will tell them, okay, the way that you do this is by doing A, B, and C. And the student will literally do A, B, and C, which may be to
Right.
correct someone else. But then they need to learn, once they've sort of practiced A, B, and C, they need to sort of learn how to modulate and do like A.5
Yeah,
and
exactly.
B.2 because that's a little bit better form of B in this particular case. So what's interesting to me is that, you sort of throw yourself into the situation where you're president, but then you're still like, okay, well, I've got to learn and be good at what I'm doing, and I need to like figure out how to
Yeah.
properly apply my skills.
Yep.
Um, what was it about so Deadlands
Yeah.
comes along, and I want to know, like, 'cause it's still there. Like I've got a copy. I think it's an awesome game. What did you like? What were you so excited about Deadlands
Well,
for?
I mean, the first big role-playing game book I ever wrote was a book called Western Hero that I wrote for
Yes,
Iron Crown, right?
right.
So when Shane's like, I have a Western idea, and I'm like, ha, you have asked the right person because
Yes.
I adore this stuff, right? The first convention game I ever played in was Boot Hill, right?
Hmm.
And it was run by a guy named Steve Winter, who is now one of my
Yes.
longtime friends, but has been
Yes.
a game designer and editor even longer than I have, and is amazing at it, right? He does amazingly good stuff. Still works on Dungeons and Dragons and
Hmm.
lots of other games, but But I've been privileged to know Steve for decades now. And but when we, Shane said, I want to do this Western game. I know you love Westerns, and let's bring in to do this. Shane and I, honestly, we just bonded being freelancers and drinking buddies at conventions for years
Right.
beforehand, right? Um, and because you get together and you commiserate with people, are like, yeah, this guy and blah blah. What's it really like? Because there's this. It was actually not quite pre-internet, but it was pre-World Wide Web, right? We had email, but we didn't have
Right.
websites in those
Yeah.
days, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you could communicate directly with people. I think we had AOL Instant Manager or
Mm-hmm.
Instant Messenger,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, being able to commiserate with people and find your community and all that kind of stuff was a lot harder back then. So when you got to a convention, you had somebody who was doing something like what you're doing, you're like, oh, we got to talk, right?
Right.
We're at the same point in our careers. We're figuring all this stuff out. So we became pretty good friends. Um, and when he brought me out for that, and I love Westerns, the idea of taking a Western and putting magic into it. I think that's great. And then, I was just in love with the concept right away. So, the only hesitation I ever had, of course, is that just because I love something doesn't mean everybody else will love something.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to go with what you appreciate. You have to find things that speak to you. Why work on something you hate in the
Yeah.
hopes that other people will like
Yeah.
it, right? You should work on something you love in the hopes that other people will like it. But yeah, you have no control over this, right? I often try to tell people when they're creating stuff, you have no control over how people are going to react to what you do.
Right.
The only thing you can control is your attitude towards your own work.
Yeah.
So, and if you hit your deadlines, if you're being serious about this, if you're taking control over this, you can control how you treat your own work, but you cannot control how other people treat it. So
Yeah.
don't worry about that stuff.
I was going to
Focus on
say
what is good for you. Right.
I was going to say that I might have to correct myself because I had sort of said that it seemed like there's this thread of superheroes running through your career, but there's also the Western stuff
A lot of
as
Western stuff.
well.
Yeah.
Like, are those, do you, so the thing though is when I look at your stuff, you've worked in so many different genres. Is it okay to say maybe, is there one particular genre that you enjoy more than others, or are they all
I love
cool?
superheroes, and that's one of the things that brings me back. But I mean, I love science fiction, fantasy, noir, westerns, pulp, all sorts of things, right? I'm not a big fan of romances, but I've read a bunch just to check them out and see how they do it. I mean, romance is probably the best-selling genre in the entire world, right?
Yeah.
So I think as a writer, it behooves you to check out other things, even if they're not
Yeah.
really your thing entirely, just to see how they work and see why they resonate with people, right? Um, I've worked on kids properties, adult properties. I'm kind of agnostic with that kind of stuff. I'm not. To me, a lot of the time isn't whether it's the genre that's really cool. It's the execution of that genre, and it's whether or not the story is really cool or the game is really cool. Then the rest of it is just wrapping. It's try, but that sounds like you're just discarding it. I mean, also I think when you do these things, you want the mechanics and the setting to dovetail together
Right.
seamlessly. So it seems
Right.
like it's of a piece no matter what you're doing, right? But no, I'm not. If somebody asked me, like, are you interested in doing this? The funny part is I've fought against this over the years. Like at one point, I'm like, I'm just tired of fantasy. I'm not going to do that. Then I end up writing tons of fantasy stuff.
Mm.
People are like, well, could you do horror? I'm like, yeah, well, I don't really like horror. I don't read a lot of horror, but I've worked on a lot of horror properties over the years, right? Um, I'm not a guy who scares easily. I'm not a person who's very religious. I mean, I was raised Catholic, and they call you a recovering Catholic because they say just one slip, it's like alcoholism.
Right.
Just one
And you're,
slip, you're back in, right?
yeah.
But I've been recovering for 30 years now, or 40 years, whatever the hell it is. People who believe in things and magic happening and demons and devils and all sorts of mystical stuff actually happening in the planet. These folks live in a much more fantastic world than I do,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I make up all this stuff that some people are like, wow, but if you believe this stuff, to me, it's just fun. It's a story,
Yeah.
right? But it's not a real thing.
Yeah.
And to think that it is real, that always blows me away. I'm like, are you serious?
Well, but it's interesting though because like here's the and I've said this a zillion times and people that are watching are going to be like, "Oh my God, here he goes again." The interesting thing though is that the same parts of the brain that light up when real life events happen to you are lighting up when you're reading a story or when you're playing an RPG. Like when you're truly immersed and you're not just sitting there going, "Oh God, I can't wait till this game ends. I got to get home and do a bunch of chores." um, that's when you're sort of turned off and it's not going to happen. But the funny thing is, I think people that play role playing games and then sort of setting it aside, I guess, when all of that is over, do you feel like, when you were playing games, when you play a game, do you feel like you're riding that wave of in some sort, or is there a particular thing that like turns you on to a game or turns you on to an experience with a video game or tabletop game?
Yeah, I think that that sense of immersiveness really does it, right? If you could just forget for a moment that what you're doing is you're staring at a page if you're reading, or that you're playing in a game and there's dice on the table. If you forget that stuff,
Yeah.
and you're just playing in the moment, you're reading in the moment, you're watching a film and you forget that there's a border around it, that
Right.
there's seats and walls and whatever else. That to me is when something magical happens, right? And I just love being in that place, that state of flow, right, where everything just comes to you naturally. The amazing part is you can actually get in that while you're writing, even, right? If I can get in a state of flow when I'm writing, it is a most amazing place to be. And I can knock out, I can easily write 1,000 words an hour when I'm in a state of flow, and just, like, I don't even see the keyboard. It's just words coming from my head right onto the screen, and they're happening, and I can imagine everything happening around it. It's not like this magical thing like you'd see in a what's the movie about the guy who was insane and it was a mathematician, A
A
Wonderful Mind,
Beautiful
or whatever.
Mind, and I was
Beautiful
thinking
Mind,
of
right?
the one that Jodie Foster directed too, like little something, Little
Little
Man
Man Tate, I
Tate.
think, right? Yeah,
That's
yeah,
it, where you
right.
imagine.
Right. So I don't get like, diagrams show up in front of my eyes or anything like that, but you do feel like everything just clicks into place,
Hmm.
right? And really what it is, it's like the state of flow. It's basketball players get the same kind of thing, right? We're just on the court, and they call it being unconscious from the field,
Hmm.
right? So if you go up there and you're sinking 3 pointers, and the way you're sinking 3 pointers, you just boom, 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 boom. You don't think about it. Your body just knows it. You're in the flow and it happens. And if you had to stop and think about it and describe it to somebody, it would screw you up,
And
and you would be
and
going tank, tank, tank instead.
so when you sit down, like, do you have? Oh boy, ladies and gentlemen, this interview is all over the place, but it's fine. I love it. Because I don't mind at all. We're just going where it
I'm
goes.
good with it either way.
What how do you sit down to write and create then? I mean, do you sit down on a schedule and you're like, boom, it just flows? Do you have to get into the zone? Do you wait for inspiration? How
Well, I'll
does
tell
that
you,
work?
pandemic has screwed me up entirely because I've got a whole bunch of people at home that wouldn't be home normally, right? So I've got we're changing rapidly here, but my eldest son has been moving in and out, uh, but he's usually in Madison now. But we have quadruplets who are 19 years old, and
Prolific even with
there
children,
we
ladies
go.
and gentlemen.
So the quads were supposedly going off to college at the beginning of last year, but instead of doing that, and even since the pandemic began, they've been doing school virtually here at home.
Hmm.
So the moments where I would get quiet time and just be able to block everything out and do it just don't happen as often as they used to. So I think as everybody goes, the pandemic is, we're all vaccinated, and hopefully people are going back to school here. Um, and they're all old enough to be able to do this stuff. And my mother-in-law, who we had here at our house, passed in June, which means that we're not as worried about protecting her as we were before that. Um, so we're willing to be a little bit more risky with our behavior. Not that we're like, stripping down and going to Sturgis and licking people or whatever, but
I
it's
I hope not.
maybe all together. Who knows? it's, but I can't speak for the children. They're on their own. They're adults now.
Who
But
knows?
but what I normally would do, especially when my wife was when we were starting out, she was working a 9 to 5 job. I would basically get up with her, have breakfast, see her out the door, and I would work until she came home, right? And then I would screw around with her in the evenings. We go, have fun with friends, play games, watch movies, television, whatever. Um, because I knew that that allowed me to have that block of time when I was alone with
Hmm.
my thoughts and be able to do this stuff.
Hmm.
And that it also meant that in the evenings when I wanted to spend time with her, I wasn't going to feel guilty about it because I'd
Yeah.
already put in my time, right?
Right. Right. I think I kind of identify with what you're saying. Like so I have like a few things that I enjoy doing. Like I like to keep myself on a good running schedule. I like to like exercise. I like to do certain things. And as long as I've sort of hit the three or four things that I need to do in my day, I feel like the little Matt in the back of my head that tells me I should be doing better will
Right.
relax and allow me to do those things. So, um, do those? So you mentioned like, oh, I can just sit down and 1,000 words will flow in an hour. Has it always kind of been that way for you, or
It's
is
been
there a
less like
struggle?
I'm not as fast as I used to be, right?
Uh-huh.
Nowadays, because of kids being in and out, me, I'm working on like literally 5 different projects at the time right now.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was starting out, I could focus on one at a time, and we didn't have quite as many distractions in the house. I think I'll
Mm-hmm.
hopefully be able to get back to this again. But I regularly was able to write 5,000 words a day, like 5 days a week, and just boom, boom, boom. And I could set my clock by that. Um, what My secret was always outlining, honestly, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would work with different as a freelancer. When I was working with different companies, they would always insist on having an outline so that they would approve it before I went to work,
Mm.
right? Because honestly, it's a time saving measure. Because if somebody else has got veto power over what you're writing,
Yeah.
you don't want to get to the end of it and have them say, no,
Yeah.
that's not what I wanted at all.
Right.
Because then I have to go back and rewrite all that stuff, right? But if I have an outline that says, I'm going to write 2 pages on this, 3 pages on this, a paragraph on this. We're going to do some of these rules over here, bit of fiction over here, and we plot out the whole book, and we know
Mm-hmm.
exactly what it's going to be. Ideally, outlines can change, but we have a loose outline that tells us what's going to be, and then they say, yes, that's what I want. Then I can go write that without having a voice in my head saying, are you sure that's what they want the entire
Right.
time, right?
Right.
Or even now that I write for myself a lot of time, I don't have to think, are you sure that's what you want, right? Because I think that's what writer's block usually comes from, is when people get to a point and they're like, I don't know where they should go. I'm not sure how to go from here. So if you can figure out the plot of a story before you write the story, and then it makes it a lot easier to write at speed. Some people, that sucks all the fun out of it, right?
Right.
Writing is an act of discovery just as much as reading is an act of
Right.
discovery, right? You're learning the story as you go. But if you can figure out just the broad outlines of the plan, that the plot that you're working on, and then try to follow those closely or closely enough, that kind of frees you up to not second guess yourself the entire time, right?
How?
Now, I have a technique where I basically will do, I'll break it down into chapters. I'll write
Mm-hmm.
2, 3 sentences per chapter,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'll write off that, right? So it's a very loose outline. And if I come up with a better idea somewhere along the way,
Right.
I've not done so much work that I feel wedded to that. I
Right.
can throw it out entirely. Sometimes I've re-outlined a book 2, 3, 4 times. I'll say, oh, I got a great idea, and I'll write from there. And I'll stop. I'm like, oh, I'm stuck again. I'll stop. I'll rework the plot from there, see where it takes me, and I'll come back and start writing again. And I've done that sometimes 3 or 4 times before I get to the end of a book. Right nowadays, I'm used to it. I know what I'm doing, so I can usually do one outline and just write it all the way home. But especially when I was starting out, being able to do that and being able to so not feeling like those words were so precious that I couldn't get rid of them, right?
Right.
Because I think, again, that's what people do. Is Mike Stackpole was the guy who mentored me in writing
Mm-hmm.
novels, actually, right?
Mm-hmm.
He
Yep.
started out in game design, moved on to doing novels.
I
I said
Jedi, I think, was his book,
that was
right?
his big
That
one,
was that's like
exactly.
his that's like a classic. Everybody always
It
talks. It's
is.
like
I
a
mean, the whole X-wing stuff that he
yeah.
wrote too, fantastic stuff, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah.
And Mike, I met before he started doing all this stuff. He was working with Hero Games and he was doing all sorts of stuff with Flying Buffalo, and I knew him from those days. But when he started doing novels, so I would ask him, "How do you do this stuff?" We would do writing seminars together at different conventions. And one of the things I remember him saying was that you could write that first chapter and then you could polish it. You could rewrite it 20 times, polish it till it's a diamond finish, perfect cuts, everything else. And in that time, you probably could have written 20 chapters, right?
Mm.
Instead of writing in one chapter. And the funny part is, as you go along in the story, you're going to come up with another idea that's going to want to make you go back and change that chapter anyway. So you might as well just put it all down from A to B, or whatever order you need to do to get them down A to Z. Get them in whatever order you need to do, and then go back and polish it once you're all done, right? Because the other secret is, of course, that it doesn't count until it's turned into your editor.
Right.
Nobody cares,
So
right?
does that mean, and I've always kind of wanted to ask this, and I've heard only one writer or actually maybe two writers kind of not confess this, but just mention this. Does that mean that, let's say someone sat down and they read your first draft of a novel that you're writing. Let's say, like in chapter 2, you think that the bad guy is going to be sort of looking like this, but then by chapter 7, you realize that the bad guy is going to look like this.
Mhm.
When you if you change the look of the bad guy in chapter 7, you don't necessarily go back to rewrite it in chapter 2 because you just want to keep your momentum going and you think about that in your second draft and maybe you decide, well, actually, let me think in retrospect, do I like the second chapter
Yeah,
version or the seventh? So that is that kind of
that's exactly how I do it. I mean, you can write a note in the margins if you're working on something that does that, or you just write a note on a piece of paper or an Evernote or on a scratch pad or whatever, and say, "Don't forget, I changed this.
right,
I need to fix this when I go back." Right.
right.
But that's about as much attention as you should pay to it, because the decisions you made in chapter 7 are no more valid than the decisions you made in chapter 1.
Mm.
Both of those can be equally valid. Once you're done with everything, often if I have time, what I like to do is shut all that stuff away for a week or a month or whatever, and
Mm-hmm.
then come back to it cold and have a cold eye at, so I can actually have take more of an editor's eye to it. I actually started out in the tabletop industry as an editor as opposed to a writer.
I was
Right.
going to say, yeah, what was that? That was one of my questions, but what was it like to start out as an editor for Gary Gygax?
Well, Gary wasn't the first things I edited. I mean, it was pretty
Oh,
close, actually.
okay.
Actually, it was pretty close now you mentioned it. Geez.
Hmm.
But I think the trick there was that there were a lot of people who wanted to write role playing games and such. There weren't so many who wanted to edit. So
Right.
I was like,
Oh,
I could do that.
I'll do it.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, I was God, I was 19 years old, 20 years old.
I cannot imagine being 19. I mean, of course, this is the retrospect and hindsight of like knowing what the legend of Gary Gygax became. But even
Yeah, yeah.
maybe I would say back then, he was still a
Oh, we
pretty
knew then, right? I mean, this was his second company I was working for. It was New
right,
Infinities.
right.
So we all knew that, this was a guy who started Dungeons and Dragons along with Dave Arneson and Rob Kuntz
Hmm.
and Jeff Parrott and whatever else. Gary was a great designer, but he was not the only person involved. So despite the myth building that occasionally happens, and I like Gary. I love his family. His kids are great people. Well, I go to GaryCon every year and we catch up together. And they're wonderful folks, and they treat me very well, and I always like them. But that said, it was Gary who promoted this myth more than anything else. It was his game, but it was a
Hmm.
lot of people's games, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, we all knew who he was. I mean, I was impressed as hell when I was a kid to meet him. And I got his autograph, like I said. Then one of the guys that we ended up working with was Don Turnbull, who was the head of TSR UK way back in the day. And then he came over. TSR UK, it was closed down. Don came over, was living in Lake Geneva, and he was hired on to be the president of New Infinities. I remember Will taking me out to Don's house, his apartment, I guess a townhome
Hmm.
or a condo on a golf course near Lake Geneva, and Don giving me an editing test, right, and saying, "Here, mark this up with a red pen. Show me what you got."
Right.
And I'm like, "Okay, sure do." He's like, "Oh, you've determined the difference between lesser and fewer. Very well, Matthew." And I'm
Right. You are
like,
ready to leave the
exactly.
monastery.
I can't possibly do Don's Cambridge accent justice, but he was, wow, just amazing guy, true English gentleman all the way through, and
But
an excellent cook and all that.
that has to be kind of a trial by fire, like in a way. So if you're gonna like spill out of college and then end up like editing for like some big guy like Gary Gygax and the rest of the crew, like it's like you just have to learn, you have to know it and do it and kind of like like I said, it's like a trial by fire,
Well,
I would
Don
imagine.
trusted me to give it a shot enough, and then they hired me to edit novels, and then they ended up giving me a couple of Gary's books. There was a book called Master of the Game, which I think ended up getting published with somebody else eventually. And there was a module called Necropolis, which I think didn't get published by New Infinities either before it folded, eventually brought by somebody else. So I think the stuff I worked on for Gary never actually got published by New Infinities. They ended up folding. They went bankrupt. They stiffed a lot of people for a lot of money.
Yeah,
That's how
yeah.
it goes sometimes. Now,
Hopping back to the writing again. So we were talking about like the drafting and how like at a certain point, you were kind of like you learned to just sort of outline before you went. What was it to sit down and start your first one? Was it a work for hire? Did you just say,
let's
I'm
see.
gonna do this?
Are you talking about
Uh,
are you talking about a game, a novel, a
and
comic?
first
Uh,
novel, say.
all right, first novel I wrote when I was in college. It was just terrible, right? For my creative writing degree, I think maybe one of my kids has seen it and he's going to claw his eyes out, but we stopped. Um,
Right.
I'm going to find a landfill somewhere near a radioactive nuclear waste site, and we'll take
and
care of it. But
dispose of it
yeah,
properly.
exactly. But the first novel, the funny part is I was writing all these role-playing games. I was writing, hundreds of thousands, maybe a million words a year. And but I couldn't break into novels. And then part of the problem was, the ironic part was, I remember I was telling you about how I was like, I'm going to work on this stuff and I'm not going to have time to write in the evening. And the funny part is I got so busy doing role-playing game stuff, I just didn't get to doing the fiction.
Yeah.
And I was bitching openly about this at a convention at one point. And the problem was that Wizards of the Coast, or TSR actually at the time, and Games Workshop, who had both worked for, done lots of products for, they both had novel lines. And I'm like, you guys should hire me to write a novel. And they're like, do you have a novel that you can show us? I'm like, no, I can't, because no, you don't want to see that one.
Right.
And they're like, well, we can't just hire you to write a novel. It's like, the kid who can sprint saying we can run a marathon, just
right.
You don't know. All right. And we're not going to give you a contract in advance if we don't say anything. So so I was griping about this at a convention, and Ed Pugh from Reaper Miniatures overheard me and leaned over and said, Matt, I'll hire you to write a novel. I'll take your money, Ed.
Wait a minute. Does Reaper Miniatures publish, or does Ed
They had
publish?
never published a novel at that point. I don't know if they have since.
Just kind of, I don't know.
But he's like, you know what? You're going to write a 40,000 word novel, short novel. Like, that's the bare edge of what people consider novels for awards things. I'm going to pay you a nickel a word, and I'll publish it as a supplement for my Combat Assault Vehicle, CAV game, right? Which is their BattleTech knockoff game, right? It's a big giant robot mechs coming through and blasting the crap out of each other. And he says, go. I'm like, you sure? He's like, yeah. I said, okay, I'll submit an outline. You don't have to. I'm like, no, I want to. Here's my outline. Is I good? Yeah, go. I write the whole thing in a crazed flash, 40,000 words. I have a great time with it. It ends up being basically the NCAA tournament based around battling mechs, right? And I named the main character after my brother-in-law. I just had fun with it. And I sent it off to Ed. It was in his email box, and he FedExed me a check without even reading it.
Oh, wow.
Right? As soon as he got in his email box, he's like, yeah, your check's going out today. See it. You'll have it tomorrow. Just the greatest guy, right? And then like 6 months later, it was out. And what, like a lot of other publishers, it's like a year or two before anything comes out. He's like, no, I got the text here. It looks good.
Published it.
The editor, put the cover on it. Boom, it's out.
That's great.
Then I literally turned around to the guys at Workshop and TSR and said, haha, guys.
Look.
And they said, let's talk. And so
perfect.
Within a month or so of each other, I ended up signing contracts to write Blood Bowl novels for Games Workshop.
Right.
And I was originally going to write this in this series. They called it the Iconic series for Dungeons and Dragons. There were these thin 200-page novels. They were written under a house name T.H. Lane, Lain. And then that line got folded. So Steve Winter, right, who was the guy I played Boot Hill with back when I was a kid, is now my editor and says, Matt, we're looking at doing a role play or a series of novels for kids. Would you be interested in doing that? Right? Would you be interested in creating a series that we could do for young readers? And I said, yes, sign me up. So I ended up creating for them the Knights of the Silver Dragon series that ended up being like 14 novels. And I wrote the first one and the last two. So,
oh, wow. So you finally kind of did it, and you sort of broke through. And then was that something, could we say, was that something you had always been working toward anyway, or was it something?
I think so. I think eventually I was going to write fiction one way or the other, right? But, and whether it was for myself or for a tie-in, I'm kind of unusual in the sense that most tie-in writers end up starting with original novels.
Yeah.
And then somebody who owns the property will then tap you on the shoulder or tap your agent on the shoulder and say, hey, do you think they could write something in something similar that I own?
Right.
So like if you did a science fiction novel, the guys from Halo might call you up, or the guys from Aliens might call you up. If you're doing fantasy, somebody who does a fantasy property might say, I need somebody to do this now. If you're doing horror, they might contact you that way, right?
Right.
So it varies that way. But I actually started writing tie-in novels. And then I got into doing original fiction because the guy who I had written for at Games Workshop started his own original fiction imprint at HarperCollins that then got divested from HarperCollins and then became its own imprint called Angry Robot Books.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, so Mark Gascon, who was again a guy I had beers with in Nottingham when I was fresh out of college and worked for Games Workshop on a 6-month student work visa, hired me on to write the Blood Bowl novels, and then hired me, and then bought 2 novels from me for Angry Robot, and then gave me the idea for the third and said, "Would you be interested in writing that?"
Right.
I'm like, "Sure, I'll write that." So
Where
it seems
where
like
did
you'd accept that, right? And he says, "Yes, I would." So
Yeah, I mean, if he's asking you for it, you would think so.
you would think so.
What, where did the idea for Shotguns and Sorcery come from then?
That was actually that was from the Dungeons Dragons third edition world search that they did, right?
Uh-huh.
So they had this thing where they when third edition came out a few years after that, like in 2002, they said we are looking for the next new world for Dungeons and Dragons. Send in your 1-page pitch. And so I threw in a few of them, and I'm like, okay, whatever. The guy who ended up winning was Keith Baker, who I actually mentored into freelancing. The guy,
Yeah.
John Nephew from Atlas Games, said,
Yeah.
"Hey, we have this new freelancer. Matt, could you give him some tips?" And then, like a year later, Keith wins this world search contest
Right.
with Eberron. And I ended up writing a trilogy of novels for Eberron at the same time that Keith's original trilogy was coming out. So, just strange, fun stuff. Keith's another great guy, great designer. So I just happened to be lucky to know him before he hit it
Right.
big.
Right.
But I pitched it for this and it didn't go. Like it was one of 10,000, so I wasn't surprised by that. Part of the things that people tend to not think about when you're doing anything creative is that there's a very large element of luck. It doesn't matter how skilled you are or how good you are or how many friends you have or whatever else, even how much money you have. A lot of it is luck. If we can know how things would hit every time,
Mm-hmm.
never be a flop.
Right.
Right. We all know that doesn't
Right.
happen. Even people who have been doing this for years still screw things up in every creative field. So, I mean, marketing money, putting a lot of push behind something can really help, but it doesn't make something a hit. It makes something not lose money, but it doesn't make it a blockbuster hit. So yeah, I don't take it personally when something I've done doesn't get accepted. I'm like, okay, I'll move on to the next thing, or I'll pitch to something else. So I took that property and I pitched it around, and I ended up Mongoose Publishing agreed to
Mm-hmm.
license it from me as a property, and then pay me to write it as well. So I was going to get an ownership royalty and then a fee for actually writing it as if I was just freelancing, but I'm freelancing for my own product, which is kind of wild. And that was back in 2001. And that fall, my wife became pregnant with quadruplets. And so that just threw my life into absolute chaos.
Yeah.
And for years, and I'm like, Matt, God, what was his name? I'm bad on last names today. Anyway, Matt at Mongoose talked to me and said, I understand, if you can't get to it, you can't get to it, move on to other things. So we parted ways amicably. Like 10 years later, Robin Laws is looking around for somebody to write stories for this idea he has called the New Hero, which is the idea that the traditional idea of a hero is this narrative arc where you have somebody who goes through this incredible process that changes something inside of them.
Sure, the journey.
Become a better person or a worse person, whatever, but something changes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Robin had this theory that actually when it comes to serial fiction, like television or comic books or whatever, or pulp, that doesn't work. Batman doesn't change. Sherlock Holmes doesn't change.
Yeah.
James Bond doesn't change, right?
Right.
These guys you see over and over don't change. He says these are actually not your narrative heroes. These are what we call iconic heroes. They change the world about them by being true to themselves, right? So Robin's like, I want to have people write stories about those kind of characters. And so I dredged up Shotguns and Sorcery and wrote my first short story for that. And I enjoyed doing it. Robin had a great time with it. It came out in the New Hero Volume 2. Then Steve Sullivan, who is from TSR and then also from Pacesetter, asked me to write a story for the Origins Awards or the Origins Writers Symposium anthology. And I wrote another one for that. And I'm like, oh, good, I could actually do this. So then things got crazy. In 2012, I decided to do this thing called 12 for 12, which was this crazy project where I decided I would write a dozen novels in a year, right?
I was afraid you were going to say that. I was like, 12 for 12. He surely can't mean 12 novels in 12 months. That would be insane.
I could do that, right? And I cheated a little bit. I said, they're only going to be 50,000 word novels, right? They're going to be short ones. Right? Your traditional novel nowadays is anywhere from 80 to 120, or usually 80 to 100, unless it's fantasy, in which case you can go really big.
Yeah.
Nowadays, like Chuck Wendig's writing 200,000 word horror novels, but Stephen King and Chuck can get away with that kind of stuff. Most of
Yeah.
us write smaller things. So I said, I'm going to write 12 books. I'm going to break them up into 4 trilogies. I'm going to run a Kickstarter for each one of them to help fund my time in the publication of these things. And we did it. It went pretty well. I ended up funding all 4 Kickstarters, and I did not quite write a dozen novels that year, though. I wrote 9 of those novels, and
that's still pretty good.
And I wrote a tie-in novel for the Leverage TV show, and I wrote StarCraft 2 novella, and 9 issues of the Magic the Gathering comic book.
When do you eat, sleep?
Well, the kids destroyed my sleep schedule for years. Honestly, I was lucky to get 6 hours of sleep for probably.
Did you use that time, like when the little ones are growing up and they're keeping you up? Did you actually take advantage and write during it, or were you struggling to
I would
get
write
some
anytime
sleep?
I would get a chance. Right. When my eldest was born, when he was just a baby, and I was writing Brave New World, that role playing game, I literally would have him on my lap right here, and I would reach across him to get to the keyboard and type. Right. Just so I can get the stuff done and hit my deadlines and everything
That
else.
is dedication, ladies and gentlemen.
Got to get it done, and you don't get paid. You don't get to feed the child if you don't get to get the work done.
It's interesting that Shotguns and Sorcery starts out as a setting, and then it becomes a fiction, or it becomes fiction, and then it goes back to being a setting again,
Yeah,
right?
then it becomes a role-playing game.
Yeah.
After I'd done the Kickstarter, this company that did these interactive ebooks reached out to me and said, we'd like to license it for an interactive ebook. They did a really good one. I think it was a Frankenstein, like a modern Frankenstein thing that Jordan Stratford wrote. And it was really well done. And then they ran another Kickstarter for like a dozen of these things, and it flopped terribly. And the whole company went bankrupt. And they're like, well, we're not going to get to yours. You were going to be number 3. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
But the artist they had lined up was a guy named Jeremy Muller. And Jeremy said, Matt, I'm just in love with this setting. I want to do something with it. Can we do this ebook? I'm like, I don't know how to do that. You know how to do that? It's like, okay. But I know role-playing games. We do a role-playing game. And I'm like, and I fought against it for like a year. I'm like, no, Jeremy, if I ever do a role-playing game, I'll just do it myself. I know what I'm doing with this stuff. And about 2 years into it, I'm like, fine. I'm never going to get to this. You want to do it?
Right.
I'll let you publish.
Go ahead.
Here's your license. So in 2015, they ran the Kickstarter for that. Unfortunately, Jeremy ended up going through a divorce, and his life went off the rails after the whole thing got funded. And so by 2020, he had not fulfilled the entire thing.
Yeah.
So, 5 years in, and it's supposed to be like a year or and a half to actually get it done. And so the license expired, and I looked at Jeremy. I said, if you want the license and you think you can continue to do this and you think that's good for you, then I'm willing to extend this. But let's look at this realistically and say, maybe this isn't a good idea.
Right.
And if it's not a good idea, I will help you fulfill these things. We'll end the license. I'll start publishing them. I'll fulfill your obligations. I'll do the writing. You'll do the artwork. I'll publish them for you. And then we'll just call it quits.
Right.
And he put up the money for the printing and everything for the main book. So that had already been done. So I wasn't out cash out of pocket so much as I was paying myself and some editors. Right. And I paid my son Marty to do some stuff for me too. And so that worked out pretty well. We're right now still have to finish a comic book, which is done except for the cover that Jeremy has to provide for us. And we have to do an art book, which is just a matter of me sitting down and putting all the pretty pictures in order and writing little captions, which shouldn't seem like a big deal, but I'm crazy busy at the moment, mostly with other projects and getting kids in and out of the house this month. So hopefully next month I'll be able to polish those off pretty quickly.
Right. Well, I know a lot of people are super happy with the game. Like, there's so many people. Like, because I'm actually like a big Cypher fan.
Oh yeah.
And like I love the Cypher system, and I have so many of my friends are in that circle, and they're always kind of talking about the game. So I know that it's people love it, and I know it's I feel embarrassed saying it sometimes when my guests come on the show, but I haven't had the opportunity to play it myself. But on the other hand, I think with Matt Forbeck, I have an excuse. He's got 8 billion different things that, but the artwork is beautiful. It's a beautiful looking book, and you can tell the care that went into it. Was let me ask you this, because I know that we're kind of running out of time, and I know you have many children to take care of and many other books to write and RPGs to work on and all of that. Maybe in the closing few minutes, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, I think there's a unique opportunity here in that you've worked on at least 4 superhero role-playing games, maybe 5. There's
I've lost track.
4 or
Yeah. I
5,
mean, depends
and
how you want to define it, right? I've done superhero games and I've done, like, I wrote a chapter of the JLA source book for the West End version of DC Heroes.
mm,
Um, I worked on the Authority. I worked in the Margaret Weiss Marvel game. I worked in Marvel Heroes Battle Dice, all sorts of different things. So,
what I'm kind of interested in hearing about here is a little bit behind the idea of how you make maybe each one of those games unique or have its own flavor. Because
right.
I feel like there's a really good opportunity to ask you some questions about this. Like you have done 4 or 5 different games, and obviously you might have some things that you think work really well, others that don't. And then on the other hand, you also have to inject the feeling of Marvel versus, say, the Authority,
Right.
which are very different tones and
Yes.
looks and feel. Um, how do you approach writing each one of these and working on each one of these?
Well, to be clear, I wasn't the lead designer on
Right.
most of the projects, right? I mean, for the Authority, I think it was Jesse Scoble, who's
Mm-hmm.
an old friend of mine who's working for Ubisoft
Yes.
nowadays.
Yes.
He worked on Assassin's Creed, the last few of them, right? He's a great writer. And for the Margaret Weiss version of the Marvel game, that was Cam Banks who did it. He
Mm-hmm.
brought me in as part of what hey, we did make it back. Oh, no worries at all. Yes. Okay. Good to know. It happens. I thought it was my internet. I'm like, I always go to the site, is my internet working? I'm like, hey, wait, it is working. I can hear you just fine, but I'm not sure how it's. Hmm. No worries.